Obsession, Big Butts, and Germ Warfare. Today we're doing a deep dive into Dan Clowes' underrated masterpiece, David Boring. Hi, I'm Riley. This is Vibe Killer. Before we get to the comic, let's talk a little bit about Dan Clowes. Dan Clowes is an American comic creator, probably best known for his graphic novels Ghost World and Like a Velvet Glove Cast in Iron, and of course his iconic cult classic series 8 Ball, where those stories originated. But today we're going to talk about his third graphic novel, the often misunderstood and completely underrated David Boring. And this one's going to be kind of a deep dive, so spoilers ahead. The book follows the titular character, David Boring, and he actually is pretty boring as a person. He works as a night watchman at a tech firm. He only really has one friend, and they don't do much together besides drink and complain about women. He doesn't seem to have any interests or hobbies. What David does have, however, is obsessions and solipsistic tendencies. What is he obsessed with, you ask? Big butts. Or more specifically, a very idealized standard of feminine beauty, which includes a fairly big serving of cake. This guy really likes butts.
I like big butts and I cannot lie.
But that's not what the story's about. I mean, it is, but it's not. Because it's kind of about itself as a story. Okay, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Let's do it like this. So the plot of David Boring is very weird. David Boring lives in an unnamed city with his friend from childhood, Dot, a lesbian who is unlucky in love and nearly as obsessed with girls as David is. The story has a few false starts, including a detached sexual experience between David and an actress that he's barely even attracted to, a former friend visiting from out of town, and then that same friend gets murdered, and David flies back home to go to the funeral. And that's where the story actually starts. Kind of. So on the way to the airport to fly to his dead friend's funeral, David meets Wanda, who is David's physical ideal of a woman, and he becomes obsessed. Mostly because of her big butt, but also because she looks like his cousin, but also his mom a little bit, and like some drawing that he pulled out of a magazine. It's such a weird book. Now obsessed with Wanda, David just straight up stalks her, and then shoehorns himself into her life until they end up dating. But once they're seeing each other, David finds out that Wanda is pretty modest, and she won't have sex with him, or even let him touch her butt through her clothes, which all but drives him crazy. When they finally do have sex, it's only once, and soon after she breaks up with him, and then disappears without a trace. And then David gets shot in the head. And that, my friends, is where the book really starts. David and his mom and his best friend all go to a man-made island and are joined there by some Canadian relatives and the island's caretaker. And then there's a terrorist attack on the mainland and everyone's stuck on the island, and then there's a couple of deaths and something like incest, and okay, this isn't working. Let me try this. So David Boring isn't about any of that stuff I said before. What David Boring is about is itself as a story. So towards the beginning of the video, I mentioned that David has solipsistic tendencies, and what I mean by that is that he acts like he's the main character of a story. But he seems to think that he's in a movie and not a comic book, and the way that I read that is that we're supposed to think of him as narcissistic and somewhat delusional and like self-important. So since David's the narrator, we kind of see the story through his eyes, and by that I mean we see it as a movie he thinks he's in. The story is broken into 3 acts. Each act has its own climax, and then at the very end of the book, we're treated to a complete cast of characters, including featured extras, kind of like the end credits of a film. Not because the story is necessarily over, but because that's where David wants the story to end. At a certain point, he gets fed up with his own narrative. And as a narrator, David is completely unreliable. He presents information out of order, he often skims past entire conversations and experience, and then filling in the gaps with his overlapping narcissistic internal monologue. A lot of stuff happens in this book, and I do mean a lot of stuff. But at the same time, it feels like nothing is happening at all. Because it kind of isn't. The longer the book goes on, the harder it is to nail down a plot. Because every time a story starts to take hold, David steers it off course with his internal monologue.
Bubble butt, bubble, bubble, bubble butt, bubble butt, bubble, bubble, bubble butt.
Either that or his other all-consuming obsession that I haven't had a chance to mention yet somehow, which is the Yellow Streak, a comic book that his absentee father wrote in the 1970s. I mean, David is super obsessed with this comic. You'd think it was filled with butts or something. But eventually, almost unnoticeably, the actual plot of the story comes to the surface. In the third act, David tries to write a screenplay to justify his existence, but he gives up because he can't think of a story worth telling. And that's kind of what David Boring is about. It's a book about a main character struggling to find a story for himself. At first, it's about him in the city with his best friend. Then it's about an old acquaintance getting murdered. Then it's about a new romance blooming from a chance encounter. Then it's about a secluded island. Then it's about a gentleman rivalry. Then it's about corrupt policemen. But it's not really about any of that stuff, because it's about big butts, a missing father, an overbearing mother, and a guy who can't tell a story even though he desperately wants to. Okay, so now that I've been able to tell you what the book is kind of about, you might be asking, but is that even good? And I'm going to answer that question right after this. This video is brought to you by me. I have a webcomic series called Party Till We Die. It's about Frankie the Bard and Gilbert the Fighter and all the adventures that they have. You can read my comic for free at partycomic.com, and while you're there, you can pick up some cute postcards, some dumb little stickers, and this limited edition zine that I made that's half D&D comics and half my dumb take on old comic strips and cartoons I grew up watching. And of course, if you like this video and want to see more, a quick like and subscribe will help us out a lot. And now, with that out of the way, on to Act 3 of David Boring. So as chaotic as the plot may be, the book is really fun to read. Almost impossible to guess what's going to happen before it happens. And it's kind of fun to be dragged around like that by a story. And the art's just beautiful. Of course there's all those butts I talked about, but there's also full-color snippets from his father's comic, violence, intimacy, iconic set pieces, mystery, and you're not going to believe this, but even more butts. The story being about a story that's trying to be a story is kind of profound, because that's kind of how life is. Things don't happen in 30-minute increments, or 24-minute increments if you're accounting for commercials. There's no 3-act structures with a beginning, a middle, and an end. You don't go on a hero's journey in real life. You might try to apply a narrative to things that are happening to you, but then things just keep happening. Fathers leave. Friends die. People cheat. All of this weird stuff happens to you, and you try to take the pieces and make it into the story of your life, but most of it just doesn't fit. And then eventually you lose the thread on what your story was supposed to be, and you just kind of bounce around from chaotic moment to chaotic moment. And then, when things get really crazy, you return to the things you really care about, the stuff you know for certain. Butts and that weird comic your dad made. If you like the show, please like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Vibe Killer.